Hi everybody, welcome back to the Zodcast on Subscribestar. I hope everybody's doing well. This episode is of course going to be about Brian Hartnell. That's why I'm calling it Heart to Hartnell. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you can always go see these videos much earlier on Subscribestar. And of course there's going to be some Subscribestar only content that will never be put on YouTube. And there's definitely some videos that I want to keep on Subscribestar only for lots of different reasons. And if you watch that, you'll know why. But I want to focus this one on Brian Hartnell, and this one probably will go to YouTube in a couple weeks or so. But I always like knowing a little bit more about how Brian Hartnell felt about being a Zodiac Killer victim, of course, at the Lake Berryessa attack on September 27th of 1969. And famously, Brian Hartnell's known not to really ever talk about the attack because early on he wanted to help because he thought that if his input could help to lead to the Zodiac's capture, he would definitely be interested in that. But after so many years went by, he felt that the Zodiac would probably never be apprehended. I still believe that's what he thinks. And I'll be reading parts of an article I found about him that sheds a little more light on how he thinks more recently. I think the article's only a year or two old, so it's somewhat recent as far as Brian Hartnell's thoughts. Of course, Brian Hartnell did participate in the 2007 movie Zodiac from David Fincher. And for people that know the story about that, they had reached out to Brian Hartnell and asked him to participate in that movie, and he declined. And I think somehow Brian Hartnell's son, one of his two sons, got some information from Fincher himself or one of his assistants or something, and he became aware who it was and that some other movies that David Fincher had been involved in, and kind of, approached his father and said, hey, this is a pretty big time production. You may want to look into this. So at the behest of his son, Brian Hartnell decided to meet with David Fincher and talked about what the movie would be like and how he wanted to reproduce it and just be very historically accurate. So Brian eventually agreed. But after Brian participated in that movie, he said scant little about the case. So I always am looking out for any new comments that might come from Brian Hartnell. So as you can see, this shot on the screen, of course, this is Brian, and a picture of Cecilia Shepard. He was born July 1st, 1949. He's now 73 years old. Said he was born in Vallejo. I need to double check that. I think that's just maybe ironic that if he was actually born in Vallejo and then becomes a Zodiac Killer victim, because he's originally from Oregon. So I'm not really sure how he wound up being born in Vallejo, but that's what it says. I know that Brian's father was actually from Bellingham, Washington, so I think it's probably more likely that Brian was also born in that area, and that's probably a mistake, but I don't know for sure, but I'll find out. Brian's name, of course, is Brian Calvin Hartnell. His middle name comes from his father's first name, Calvin Hartnell, and Calvin was a Seventh-day Adventist preacher, and here's a picture of him, a later photo of him and his wife. These are Brian's parents, so that's where Brian obviously got his middle name from, Calvin Hartnell. And pretty interesting that he was a son of a Seventh-day Adventist preacher. I'm sure that must have been pretty interesting. And going back through Brian's family line, I noticed that his father's grandfather was actually a pretty early Mormon convert. So I'm not really sure how Calvin got into being a minister for the Seventh-day Adventist church, but that's how things turned out. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Here is a shot of a young Calvin Hartnell back from Bellingham, Washington, from when he was in college. So just kind of an interesting footnote there. And this was the article I was talking about. It was from a local area where Brian lives now, which is the Loma Linda, California area, which is also referred to the Inland Empire east of Los Angeles, and that includes Riverside, includes Redlands, California, where Brian Hartnell's law office is located. Brian went on to become an attorney, and he practices probate law, real estate law, some various different legal disciplines, but he was a very accomplished attorney. He's been written up in a lot of legal reviews, and he's very active in the area as far as charity, and he's involved with a lot of music programs and raising money for music programs. and various other charity organizations. But it's kind of ironic that he winds up kind of near Riverside, California. And the reason he did, because he went and got engaged to a lady and eventually married her, and she was a medical student at Loma Linda University, and she went on to become an anesthesiologist. So that's kind of how that played out for Brian. He's a lawyer, his wife's an anesthesiologist. They have 2 grown sons who have young families of their own. So he's done really well. He's had a really good life despite being a Zodiac Killer victim. And then the name of this article is actually says attorney, bid actor, and Zodiac Killer survivor. Now, of course, the bid actor part is referring to a small part that Brian had in the movie Zodiac. Now, of course, he was heavily involved and shown in the documentary that came out with the Fincher Zodiac film called, of course, This is the Zodiac Speaking, where he recreates the scene and narrates what happened to him and Cecilia when they were attacked by the Zodiac on September 27th, 1969. And, obviously it shows where he goes back to the police station there in Napa. They show the car door that Zodiac rode on, his 1959 Volkswagen Carmen Ghia car door. But the bid actor piece actually refers to a scene where Brian's actually in the movie with his family. And I went back and looked through the movie and I couldn't find this particular scene, but Brian actually is portraying a police officer in one of the scenes with, I believe, at least one or both of his sons and possibly his wife. And it talks about it in this article. I didn't even know that. And of course, Brian did not want to accept any money for his participation in either of those projects, the movie or the documentary. He just wanted to help out because he thought it was a worthy effort and how they want to portray it really accurately. But one perk that he did get, and it says in this article, was that they used a 1959 Volkswagen Carmen Ghia for some of the scenes in the movie, and they wound up giving Brian that car, to sort of replace the one he had back when he was attacked with Cecilia. And I don't know what became of the car. Obviously, the car door is in evidence at Napa PD, and they've covered it up with paper. It was actually stored up on a shelf. I know there's a video on YouTube that shows the car door, and I think it shows also in This is the Zodiac Speaking. It'll show where they walk into the police station and they're I think looking at the car door where Zodiac wrote with a black marker. But I thought that was interesting that they did give him the car they used for the movie. So in this article, and I'll put a link to it in the description of this video, Brian's talking about what it's like having been a Zodiac Killer victim. And he says here, he's talking about how often he gets approached by people wanting to talk about it, or someone trying to put a suspect in front of him, or another one of these "my dad was Zodiac" nonsense suspects. But it says, I would say that the longest stretch when I haven't gotten a letter from somebody who says their uncle did it, or somebody's writing a book, is probably 3 months at the most, says Hartnell. So that's pretty interesting. So yeah, he's getting bombarded all the time. I mean, I'm kind of shocked he could even go 3 months, because he's not too hard to find. He's a lawyer. He's, advertises. I'm sure he's got a good book of business, but, he's out there in the public, and it never hurts to have even more clients. Even in his 70s, he's got a very active legal business. So I thought that was an interesting comment. And I'll read this part real quick. And I know I mentioned a lot of this, and it's talking about how he wound up in Southern California. It says, it was his intent to remain in Northern California, but one can say that love got in the way. He was dating Monica Newman, his wife now for 38 years, and she was attending Loma Linda University to become a doctor. Hartnell moved to the local area when she was performing her medical residency, and here they are still in the Inland Empire all these years later. His wife is now an OB anesthesiologist at Loma Linda University Medical Center, and he operates a successful legal practice with specialties in probate, estate planning, conservatorships, and healthcare. They have raised 2 adult sons, Benjamin and Jonathan. I believe Benjamin's the one that helped spearheaded getting Brian involved with the Fincher film. And here's a piece I like the most. It says, before he moved to the Inland Empire, it is possible that Hartnell may have had a second encounter with the Zodiac Killer. As previously noted, one of the prime suspects was Arthur Lee Allen. There was a period of time when Allen was working at a store, and the police asked Hartnell to go into the store as if he was going to purchase something to see if he could recognize Allen. Hartnell observed Allen and concluded that he was not the same person who had attacked both he and Shepard. I mean, that is damning against Arthur Lee Allen being the attacker at Berryessa, which I have said all along that he was not. There's a million reasons why Arthur Lee Allen could not have been the attacker at Berryessa. And when a guy like Hartnell, who engaged the Zodiac in conversation, makes a statement like that, saw Allen at work. This, of course, he's talking about, people know this, where Allen was working at the Ace Hardware store in Vallejo, and Brian went in there to observe him. Said it's not the guy. And, of course, Zodiac was wearing the hood at Lake Berryessa, so Brian couldn't see his face, but he interacted with him. And he, watched Allen's movements. I'm sure he heard him speak. And I think in the Zodiac film, he does, say a few words when Brian goes up to the counter. So he was confident that was not the guy that attacked him and Cecilia. That is just a huge blow to any Allen is a solo Zodiac suspect. It really is, because Brian is a smart guy. He's articulate, engaged in Zodiac conversation, like I said, was trying to pick up clues about him, asked him interesting questions about, hey, I read where a lot of times people commit crimes with guns that aren't really loaded, so the penalties aren't that high. And then the Zodiac took out the magazine and showed Brian that it was a fully loaded magazine in the gun. He's a smart guy. Fortunately, he did survive, but that is just damning about him saying that Allen is not the guy. And then you have all the other reasons it could have been Allen. Allen was bald at the time. Brian and Cecilia saw the brown hair coming through the eyelets of the mask, meaning Allen would have had to have a wig on. Allen would have had to walk all that way down to the peninsula that Brian and Cecilia were on. His feet weren't really good. It just wasn't Allen at Berryessa. So the Allen supporters, that's just something they have to come to grips with. And also against Allen at Berryessa. Allen was left-handed. He could write some with his right hand, but he was a left-handed person. This was a right-handed attack. Zodiac came up to them holding a gun in his right hand. The knife he had on him was holstered on his left hip, but when he took out the knife to stab them, it was with his right hand, as in the reenactment. So that was not Arthur Lee Allen at Lake Berryessa. I know that's a bitter pill for Allen supporters to swallow, but at least they're on the right track, as Arthur Lee Allen did have some involvement in these crimes. And then jumping off of that, I want to read this piece. It says, this is Hartnell talking about Arthur Lee Allen. He says, I don't think the guy, and it says Allen, they think did it, says Hartnell. Hartnell suspects that the actual killer may never be identified. He probably did not leave any prints, says Hartnell. He was a pretty smart cookie. Fully agreed there with Mr. Hartnell coming from me. He was smart. I don't think he would have left prints. And then there's always some goofball on Reddit. Oh, he definitely left prints at the Stein cab. They were in Leighton blood. It's him. Brian knows this case pretty well. He was in the movie. He was one of the victims. He's a smart guy. And he doesn't believe the Zodiac left prints. So I agree with him. And then Brian goes on to say, honestly, I do not think anybody is ever going to be caught. He continues. He was a real blowhard for the first few years and then dead silence. Hartnell suspects that the actual killer is now deceased, in custody, or in a mental health facility. So it's just interesting. I think this article is probably the only comments I've seen from Hartnell in a long, long time. But I wish he would come back out and do a couple more interviews. But I just don't see it happening. Then he ends the article with this. It says, in the final analysis, Hartnell believes that after so many years have elapsed, the perpetrator of the Zodiac crimes will not be caught. There are going to be some cases that you just don't solve, he says. And unfortunately, he could be right. I hope not. I think there are going to be some breakthroughs in the Zodiac case over the next years, with technology getting better, with people continuing to investigate. And I'm not going to give up on my theory, because I think it's the only theory and the best theory. This is Don Chaney and Arthur Lee Allen all the way. Thanks for watching, everybody, and please sure not to miss the next video about Robert Graysmith's newest edition called Shooting Zodiac. Of course, that's been out for a while, but somebody sent it to me, and I thought it was really interesting, and a lot of good Don Chaney stuff in that publication. So I was successful in going back and finding at least one screenshot of Brian's bit part in the movie Zodiac, and I want to thank Ross with Planet X Films for kind of leading me in the right direction as to where to find it. This one's in a police station. You see Brian there. I don't know if that's his wife or not, because I think she was in it too, as well as his two sons. I don't know what scene they were in, but there is Brian, of course, in the foreground with with that lady, and he's got a police badge on. So that's some of it.